The morning fog clung to the hills of Carmel by the sea like a soft gray blanket, muffling the usual chatter of tourists and the crash of waves against the shore. Inside a modest office tucked behind a row of cypress trees, Elena Ruiz adjusted the lapel mic on her blazer and checked her recorder for the third time. She wasn't nervous. She'd interviewed Oscar winners, war correspondents, even a former president. But something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the man himself. Clint Eastwood didn't do many interviews anymore, and when he did, they rarely went the way journalists expected. She'd spent the last week rereading old profiles, watching decades-old talk show clips, and scrolling through forums where fans and critics alike debated his films, his politics, even the way he squinted in sunlight. Everyone had an opinion about him, but few seemed to really know him. That was her job today. Not to rehash the legend, but to find the person underneath. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a room with someone who'd seen more of life than most people ever would, and who probably didn't care whether she got it right or not. A soft knock came at the door. An assistant poked her head in. "He'll be right out. He's just finishing up a call with his grandson." Elena nodded, glancing around. The office was unpretentious. Wood-paneled walls, a few framed movie posters turned face down, shelves lined with books on history, jazz, and fly fishing. No gold statues on display, no framed magazine covers. It felt less like the workspace of a Hollywood icon, and more like that of a retired schoolteacher who happened to have directed a few classics. When he finally appeared, he moved slowly but with purpose, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans that looked like they'd seen 100 mornings just like this. He offered a handshake, firm, dry, no extra words, and gestured for her to sit. There was no small talk about the weather or traffic. He simply poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos, set one in front of her, and sat down across the low wooden table. "So," he said, voice gravelly but calm. "What's on your mind?" Elena smiled, easing into her opening question about his latest project. A quiet drama about an aging rancher trying to keep his land in the family. He answered thoughtfully, choosing his words like someone used to working with limited resources. Every sentence felt weighed, not rehearsed. She noticed how he'd pause before speaking, as if giving the silence a chance to say something first. As the interview unfolded, she found herself relaxing. He wasn't the gruff caricature some made him out to be. He listened carefully, asked a question or two of his own about her work. Even chuckled once at a story she told about getting lost in Tokyo while chasing a lead. But then, about halfway through, the conversation drifted toward something deeper, something less about movies and more about people. "I've always believed," he said, stirring his coffee slowly, "that folks don't need saving as much as they need reminding. Reminding that they've got what it takes inside them already." Elena raised an eyebrow. It sounded poetic, sure, but also a little simple. In a world of algorithms, systemic inequality, and global crises, the idea that personal grit alone could carry someone through felt almost naive. She'd heard similar lines before, from motivational speakers, self-help gurus, politicians trying to sound folksy. Without thinking, a small laugh escaped her. It wasn't cruel, but it carried a hint of disbelief. The kind you might give when someone insists the moon landing was faked or that pineapple belongs on pizza. The room didn't go silent so much as it seemed to hold its breath. Eastwood didn't flinch. He didn't scowl or lean forward aggressively. He just looked at her, really looked, with eyes that had watched decades pass like seasons. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet steadiness, as if he'd seen this reaction before and knew it would pass. Elena felt her cheeks warm. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain that she hadn't meant to dismiss him, but he raised a hand slightly, just enough to stop her, and took a slow sip of coffee. "You're not the first to think that sounds old-fashioned," he said finally, "and you won't be the last." There was no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance. But something in the way he said it made her feel like she'd missed a layer of meaning, like she'd laughed at the surface of a deep well without realizing how far down it went. She shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of how much she'd assumed going in. She'd come prepared to dissect his career, to analyze his choices, maybe even to gently challenge his worldview. But she hadn't expected to be challenged herself, not by a man in his 90s, sitting in a quiet room with a thermos of coffee, offering something that sounded too plain to be true. For the next few minutes, The conversation stayed polite, circling back to safer topics: film scores, the changing landscape of Hollywood, his love for jazz piano. But the moment lingered between them like a note that hadn't finished ringing. Elena kept her questions crisp, her tone professional, but her mind was elsewhere. She replayed his words. They need reminding. What if he wasn't talking about bootstraps or blind optimism? What if he meant something quieter, something about dignity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience? By the time the interview wrapped, she thanked him sincerely, packing up her gear with more care than usual. As she stepped outside, the fog had lifted just enough to let a sliver of sun through. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the salt air, feeling oddly unsettled, not because of anything he'd said, but because of how easily she'd dismissed it. Back in her rental car, she scrolled through her notes, her finger hovering over the part where she'd written, "Laughs at self-reliance comment, needs context." She deleted it. Then she typed something new. His reply changed the whole room. She didn't know it yet, but that moment, the laugh, the silence, the reply that was still forming in his mind, would soon leave the quiet office behind and echo far beyond anything either of them expected. But for now, it belonged just to them. Two people from different worlds meeting briefly in a sunlit room, each carrying their own version of truth, neither quite ready to let go of it. The drive back to the city felt longer than it should have. Rain began to fall, light at first, then steady, tapping against the windshield like a quiet reminder that something had shifted. Elena kept glancing at her phone, not because she expected a message, but because she couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head, that laugh, the way the air changed after it, the look in his eyes, not offended, not angry, just seeing her, really seeing her. It unsettled her more than any sharp retort ever could. She'd interviewed plenty of people who didn't like being challenged. Some got defensive. Others changed the subject. A few even walked out. But this was different. He hadn't tried to win. He hadn't raised his voice or fired back with a zinger. He just sat there, steady as a stone in a river, letting the current of her doubt rush past him. And somehow that made her feel smaller, not him. Back at her apartment, she poured a glass of tea and spread her notes across the kitchen table. The recorder sat in the center, blinking its tiny red light like it held a secret. She pressed play. His voice filled the room, calm, unhurried. "You're not the first to think that sounds old-fashioned, and you won't be the last." Then silence. Then her own voice, bright and slightly too quick. "I guess I just wonder how that holds up when the deck's stacked against you from the start." Another pause. Longer this time. Then he spoke again, and this time something in his tone made her hit pause and sit very still. "Let me tell you about a kid I knew," he began, "back when I was working nights at a gas station in Oakland. Barely made enough to eat, let alone dream. One night this kid, couldn't have been more than 16, comes in soaked to the bone, no shoes, holding a wrench like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't ask for money, didn't ask for help. Just said, 'You got a rag I can borrow? My hands are bleeding.' Elena leaned forward even though she was alone. I gave him the rag. Watched him clean his hands like it mattered. Then he fixed a flat on an old man's truck. Didn't charge him a dime. When I asked why, he said, 'Somebody once helped me when I had nothing. Figured it was my turn.' He walked out into the rain like he owned the night." Eastwood's voice softened. "I never saw him again. But I've carried that moment for 60 years. Not because he was special, though maybe he was, but because he chose to act like he still had something to give, even when he had nothing left. That's what I mean by reminding. Not that the world's fair. Not that hard work always wins. But that even in the worst of it, you can still decide who you are." Elena stared at the recorder. Her throat felt tight. She'd expected a lecture, a defense of rugged individualism. Instead, he'd given her a story, raw, human, full of quiet dignity. No grand claims, no politics, just a moment that stayed with him like a stone in his pocket. She rewound the tape and listened again, and again. By midnight, she'd scrapped her original angle, This wasn't going to be a profile about Clint Eastwood's latest film or his views on modern cinema. It was going to be about that moment, the laugh, the silence, the story that followed. Because that was the real story, not the legend, but the man who still believed, after everything, that people could surprise you with their decency. Over. The next few days, she wrote carefully, choosing each sentence like she was placing stones across a stream, trying not to slip, trying not to disturb the water too much. She described the office, the fog, the coffee, and mismatched mugs. She included her laugh, not to shame herself, but to show how easy it is to mistake simplicity for ignorance. And she quoted his story word for word, exactly as he'd told it. When she sent the draft to her editor, she added a note. "This might not be what we planned, but it's the truth of what happened." Her editor called an hour later. "It's good," he said. "Really good. But are you sure you want to include that part where you laughed? It makes you look unsure." "That's the point," she replied. "I was." The piece ran online the following Tuesday under a quiet headline, "A Moment That Changed Everything, an Interview with Clint Eastwood." It didn't go viral right away. In fact, for the first 24 hours, it barely trended. But then something unexpected happened. A film student in Austin clipped the audio of Eastwood's story, the part about the boy with the wrench, and posted it with a black screen and white text. "Sometimes the smallest choices say the most," the caption read. It got a few hundred shares, then a few thousand. A retired teacher in Ohio shared it with her book club. A veteran in Montana posted it on a forum for first responders, writing, "This is the kind of courage we don't talk about enough." A high school coach played it for his team before a big game, not to motivate them to win, but to remind them to show up for each other, win or lose. Within a week, the clip had been viewed over 2 million times, not because it was flashy or controversial, but because it felt real. In a world full of hot takes and performative outrage, here was a man in his 90s telling a simple story about kindness, without asking for credit or applause. Elena watched it all unfold from her couch, equal parts amazed and humbled. She hadn't set out to start a movement. She'd just tried to be honest. And somehow, that honesty had found its way into living rooms, classrooms, even hospital break rooms where nurses played it during their shifts to remind themselves why they kept going. She thought about calling Eastwood to thank him, but she didn't. She had a feeling he already knew. And if he didn't, it probably didn't matter to him either way. What stayed with her wasn't the views or the shares. It was the messages she started getting, from strangers who said the story reminded them of their grandfather or a friend who'd helped them through a dark time, or a moment they'd almost forgotten when they chose to do the right thing even when no one was watching. One email stood out. It was from a young man in Detroit who wrote, "I was that kid once, no shoes, no plan, just trying to make it through the night. I didn't think anyone saw me, but reading this, it's like someone finally did." Elena read that line 3 times. Then she closed her laptop and walked to the window. The rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered on wet pavement, and for the first time in a long while she felt hopeful, not because the world had changed, but because people were still listening to stories that mattered. And somewhere, in a quiet house by the sea, an old man likely sipped his coffee, unaware that a few simple words had become a lifeline for people he'd never meet. But that was okay. He'd never needed them to know. He just needed to say it, because sometimes the most powerful things aren't shouted. They're whispered, and somehow that's how they reach the furthest. The morning after the article went live, Elena woke to a buzzing phone and a flood of notifications she hadn't expected. At first, she thought something had gone wrong. Maybe a quote was misattributed or a fact had been challenged. But as she scrolled, she realized it wasn't criticism. It was connection. Dozens of messages, then hundreds from people saying the same thing in different ways. That story stayed with me. I played it for my daughter before her first job interview. It reminded me of my dad. He never asked for help either. She made coffee, wrapped herself in an old sweater, and sat by the window reading them one by one. There was something deeply human in how people responded, not with hot takes or debates, but with memories, with gratitude, with quiet admissions of their own struggles. It was as if Eastwood's words had opened a door, and people were stepping through it not to argue but to share. Later that day, her editor called again, this time sounding both excited and slightly bewildered. "We've never had a piece take off like this," he said. "The clip's been shared by teachers, pastors, even a few senators. Not to score points, just because they liked it." Elena smiled but didn't say much. She knew why it resonated. It wasn't about politics or fame. It was about dignity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need a spotlight. Still, she couldn't shake a nagging question. What did he think about all this? Had he even seen it? She didn't dare call. But a week later, a plain envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just her name and apartment number written in neat, slightly shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. "Thanks for listening, even when you didn't agree. That's rarer than you think, no signature." But she knew. She held the note for a long time, running her thumb over the crease. It wasn't praise. It wasn't a critique. It was just acknowledgement. And somehow that meant more than any headline ever could. Meanwhile, the ripple kept spreading. A high school in Oregon used the story as a writing prompt. Students wrote about times they'd helped someone without expecting anything back, or times someone had helped them when they felt invisible. One student wrote about carrying groceries for an elderly neighbor every Sunday, not because she had to, but because it made her smile. And that was enough. The teacher posted the essays online with permission, and soon other schools were doing the same. In a small town in Iowa, a local hardware store started a wrench wall, a board where customers could leave tools they no longer needed for others to borrow. The owner said he got the idea after hearing the clip on a podcast. "Seemed like a small thing," he told a local reporter. "But if it helps one kid fix a bike or a single mom patch a leaky faucet, it's worth it." Elena read about it over breakfast, her toast forgotten. She hadn't set out to inspire hardware stores or school assignments. She'd just tried to tell what happened, honestly. And yet, here it was, real life responding in real ways. She started noticing little things in her own world, too. The barista who remembered her order without asking. The stranger who held the elevator a second longer. Not grand gestures, just tiny acts of attention. And for the first time in a while, she found herself pausing to say thank you. Not out of habit, but because she meant it. One afternoon, she visited her grandmother, who lived in a quiet assisted living home on the edge of the city. Over tea and shortbread cookies, she mentioned the story. The boy with the wrench, the gas station, the rain. Her grandmother listened, eyes soft. Then she said, "You know, I used to clean houses for families who couldn't pay in cash. They'd give me eggs from their chickens or a jar of jam or sometimes just a hug. I never thought much of it, but now, I wonder if that was my wrench." Elena reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "It was," she said softly. It absolutely was. That night she sat at her desk and reread her original article. She'd been so focused on getting the facts right that she hadn't realized she'd also captured something else. A moment of humility, of two people meeting across a divide, not with weapons, but with curiosity. And in that space, something real had grown. She thought about how often we rush to judge, to label, to assume we know what someone means before they've finished speaking. How easy it is to laugh, gently or not, when someone says something that doesn't fit our worldview. But what if we paused instead? What if we asked, "Tell me more"? Eastwood hadn't argued. He hadn't tried to convince her. He'd just shared a memory that mattered to him. And in doing so, he'd invited her, and now thousands of others, into a different way of seeing. A few days later, she received an email from a community center in New Orleans. They were hosting a storytelling night and wanted to include the wrench story as part of their theme. Small acts, big hearts. Could they read it aloud? Of course, she replied. Please do. She imagined the room. Dim lights, folding chairs, maybe a pot of coffee in the back. People leaning forward, listening. Not to a celebrity, not to a politician, but to a story about a nameless kid who chose kindness when he had nothing left to give. And in that room, someone might hear it and think, I can do that too. That was the thing about truth. It doesn't need volume to travel. Sometimes it just needs to be spoken plainly, at the right time to the right person. Elena began to understand that the viral moment wasn't really about Eastwood. It was about all the people who saw themselves in that story, or wished they could be the kind of person who would stop to help in the rain. It was about the quiet courage that doesn't make headlines but keeps the world turning. She stopped checking the view count. Stopped reading every comment. Instead, she started paying attention to the moments around her, the ones that didn't get posted online but mattered just as much. The neighbor who shoveled her walk without being asked, the nurse who stayed late to comfort a scared patient, the teenager who picked up litter on his way to school. These weren't grand gestures. They were wrenches, small, ordinary, essential, and maybe that was the real lesson. Not that we all have to be heroes, but that we all have something to offer even on our worst days, even when no one's watching. As the weeks passed, the buzz online began to settle. New stories took its place. But in living rooms, classrooms, and quiet conversations, the story remained. Not as a trend, but as a touchstone. Elena kept the note in her desk drawer. Sometimes on hard days, she'd take it out and read it again. Thanks for listening, even when you didn't agree. It reminded her that understanding doesn't always come from winning an argument. Sometimes it comes from sitting in the silence after a laugh and being willing to hear what comes next. And in a world that often feels loud and divided, that might be the most powerful thing of all. The story should have faded by now. That's how the internet usually works. Something flares up, burns bright for a few days, then gets buried under the next wave of outrage, celebrity gossip, or viral dance challenge. But this time it didn't. Weeks turned into months, and people kept coming back to that quiet exchange, the laugh, the pause, the story about the boy with the wrench. Not because it was dramatic or shocking, but because it felt like a breath of fresh air in a world that often forgets to breathe. Elena noticed it in small ways first. A teacher in Minnesota sent her a photo of a classroom bulletin, board titled "Our Wrench Moments," covered in sticky notes where students had written about times they'd helped someone or been helped, without expecting anything in return. A firefighter in Colorado mentioned during a podcast interview that he played the audio clip for his crew before every shift. Not to pump us up, he said, but to remind us why we do this, not for medals, but for each other. Then came the letters. Not emails, but real letters, handwritten on lined notebook paper, stationery with floral borders, even the back of grocery receipts. A woman in rural Kentucky wrote about how she'd been struggling to keep her family's farm going after her husband passed. One night, after reading the article, she left a basket of eggs on a neighbor's porch, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The next morning, she found firewood stacked by her back door. No, just wood. That's when I knew, she wrote. Kindness doesn't need words. Elena kept every one of them in a shoebox under her desk. She didn't share them online. They didn't belong to the internet. They belonged to the quiet space between people who chose to believe in each other, even when things were hard. Meanwhile, Eastwood stayed out of the spotlight. No interviews, no follow-up statements. He went back to his routine, morning walks, tinkering with old cars, playing piano in the evenings. When a reporter finally tracked him down for comment, he simply said, "I told a story. If it meant something to folks, that's enough." That was it. No grand declaration. No attempt to ride the wave. Just a man who'd said what he believed and let it go. But the world kept carrying it forward. In a youth center in Chicago, counselors started using the story as part of their mentorship program. They'd ask the kids, "What's your wrench?" Not in a preachy way, but as an invitation. One teenager who'd been in and out of trouble since middle school wrote a poem about giving his lunch to a new kid who'd forgotten his. "I didn't think it mattered," he read aloud during a group session. But he smiled, and that felt like winning. In a hospital in Portland, a nurse taped a printed copy of the story to the break room fridge. "For the days when we forget why we started," she wrote at the bottom. Other staff members added their own notes about holding a patient's hand during a scary procedure, or staying late to cover a shift for a co-worker with a sick child. The page became a patchwork of quiet courage. Even in unexpected places, the story found roots. A software company in Seattle replaced their usual motivational posters with a simple quote from the interview. "You don't need saving. You need reminding." Employees said it changed the tone of meetings, less about performance metrics, more about supporting each other through tough deadlines. Elena watched all of this unfold with a mix of awe and humility. She hadn't created a movement. She'd just been honest about a moment that changed her. And somehow that honesty had given others permission to be honest too, to admit they'd been that kid in the rain, or that they wanted to be the one who offered the rag. She started noticing how often people were looking for ways to connect, not compete. At the grocery store, strangers held doors longer. On the subway, someone offered their seat without being asked. These weren't grand acts, but they felt different now, more intentional, more seen. One afternoon, she visited a community garden in Oakland, the same city where Eastwood had worked at that gas station decades ago. Volunteers were planting tomatoes and squash, laughing as they got dirt on their jeans. She struck up a conversation with an older man tending to a row of peppers. "Funny thing," he said, wiping his brow. "My grandson showed me that clip last month. Said it reminded him of me. I used to fix bikes for kids in the neighborhood back in the 80s. Never charged a dime. Just like seeing them ride off with a grin." Elena smiled. "Sounds like you were someone's wrench." He chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe we all are if we pay attention." That night she sat on her balcony watching the city lights flicker on one by one. She thought about how easy it is to feel powerless these days, to believe that one person can't make a difference. But what if the real power isn't in changing the world all at once, but in changing one moment for one person? The story had never been about Eastwood's beliefs being right or wrong. It was about the space between judgment and understanding. About how a single moment of humility on both sides could open a door neither expected. She realized something else, too. The reason the story lasted wasn't because it was perfect. It was because it was human. It had awkwardness, her laugh, silence, his pause, vulnerability, his story, and growth, her reflection. Real life isn't polished. It stumbles, questions, listens, and sometimes, just sometimes, learns. A few weeks later, she got an invitation to speak at a small college in Vermont. Not about journalism, but about listening across differences. She almost said no. She didn't feel like an expert. But then she remembered the note in her drawer. "Thanks for listening, even when you didn't agree." So she went. Standing in front of a room of students, she didn't give a lecture. She told the story, her version of it. The fog, the coffee, the laugh she couldn't take back, the silence that followed, and the words that changed everything. When she finished, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Do you think he knew it would go this far?" she asked. Elena shook her head. "I don't think he cared. He just told the truth as he knew it. And that was enough." Afterward, students came up to her one by one, not for autographs, but to share their own wrench moments. A boy who'd stayed with a friend during a panic attack. A girl who'd apologized to her brother after years of silence. Each story simple, each one powerful. Driving home, Elena rolled down the window and let the cool air rush in. The sky was clear, stars scattered like scattered salt. She thought about how stories travel, not through algorithms or headlines, but through hearts. One person hears it, carries it, shares it when the time is right. And somewhere in a quiet house by the sea, an old man probably didn't know any of this was happening. And that was okay, because the best gifts aren't given for thanks. They're given because they need to be passed on. The world kept spinning. Problems didn't vanish. But in thousands of small corners, people were choosing kindness. Not because it was trending, but because they remembered a story about a boy in the rain. And decided to be someone's wrench, too. Months had passed since that foggy morning in Carmel, and life had settled back into its usual rhythm. Except it hadn't. Not really. Elena still walked the same streets, took the same subway, drank coffee from the same chipped mug, but something inside her had shifted. She noticed things now that she used to rush past. The way a bus driver greeted every passenger by name. How a street musician kept playing even when no one dropped a coin. The quiet nod between two strangers holding the same umbrella in a sudden downpour. These weren't grand gestures. They were ordinary moments, but they carried weight now, like tiny stitches holding the world together. She'd stopped thinking of the interview as a story she'd written. It had become something else, a mirror, a compass, a reminder. Not just for her, but for countless others who'd found their own reflection in that quiet exchange between two people who didn't agree but chose to listen anyway. One rainy afternoon, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box, hand-carved, smooth to the touch. Lifting the lid, she found a single wrench nestled in soft cloth. Old, worn, but carefully cleaned. Tucked beneath it was a note in familiar handwriting. For the next time someone needs reminding. She held the wrench in her palm, its metal cool and solid. It wasn't symbolic. It was real. And that made all the difference. She didn't post it online, didn't write about it. She kept it on her desk next to her notebook and coffee mug, a quiet companion in her daily work. Sometimes when she felt cynical or tired, she'd pick it up and remember, strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the choice to help when no one's watching. Sometimes it's the courage to admit you were wrong. Sometimes it's just showing up, soaked and shoeless, and still offering what you can. Eastwood never spoke publicly about the clip again. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. He'd shared what mattered to him, not for fame or debate, but because it was true. And in a world hungry for authenticity, that truth had traveled farther than any speech ever could. Elena began to change the way she approached her work. She asked fewer leading questions and listened more. She gave people space to be complicated, to hold beliefs she didn't share, to stumble over their words, to change their minds. She realized that real understanding doesn't come from winning an argument, but from being willing to sit in the uncomfortable space where two truths meet, and neither one has to lose. At a journalism conference later that year, someone asked her what made that interview different. She thought for a moment before answering. "I didn't go in trying to prove a point," she said. "I went in trying to understand a person, and somewhere along the way I let myself be changed by what I heard." That, she realized, was the heart of it. Not persuasion, not performance, just presence. Back home, she started a small project, no fanfare, no funding. She visited community centers, schools, even shelters, and simply asked people to share a time they'd been someone's wrench, or someone had been theirs. She recorded their voices, not for a podcast or a series, but to keep, to remember. Some stories made her laugh. Others made her cry. All of them reminded her that humanity isn't found in headlines. It's found in basements, bus stops, hospital hallways, and gas stations in the rain. One evening, while sorting through recordings, she came across a voice she recognized, her grandmother speaking during a visit months earlier. "You know," the old woman had said, stirring her tea, "I used to think kindness was something you did when you had extra. But I've learned it's something you do when you have nothing left, and that's when it matters most." Elena played the clip again, then again. She thought about the boy with the wrench, the nurse in Portland, the farmer in Kentucky, the teenager in Chicago. None of them had much to give, but they gave anyway. And in doing so, they'd built something no algorithm could replicate: trust. The internet moved on, as it always does. New controversies flared. New stars rose. But in quiet corners of the world, the story lived, not as a trend, but as a practice. A teacher paused before scolding a student and asked, "What's going on?" A stranger paid for the coffee of the person behind them in line. A father apologized to his daughter after years of silence. Small acts. Big hearts. Elena never expected any of this to happen. She'd just tried to be honest about a moment that shook her. And in doing so, she'd accidentally reminded people of something they already knew but had forgotten: that we're all capable of decency, even on our worst days. One spring morning, she returned to Carmel. Not for an interview, just to walk. She stood on the bluff overlooking the ocean, the wind tugging at her coat. She didn't go to his office. She didn't need to. She already carried what mattered. As she turned to leave, she saw a young boy crouched by the path, struggling to fix a loose wheel on his bike. Without thinking, she knelt beside him. "Need a hand?" she asked. He looked up surprised, then nodded. She reached into her bag, not for a tool, but for the wrench. She handed it to him. "This one's seen better days," she said with a smile. "But it still works." He took it carefully, his fingers brushing the worn metal. "Thanks," he said softly. She stayed while he worked, offering quiet suggestions when he got stuck. When the wheel was secure, he stood grinning. "It's fixed." "Looks like it," she said. "Now go ride." He pedaled off down the path, the wrench tucked in his backpack. She watched until he disappeared around the bend, then turned toward the sea again. Somewhere behind her, in a quiet house among the cypress trees, an old man likely sipped his coffee, unaware that his story had become a thread in the lives of strangers. And that was all right. Some gifts aren't meant to be returned. They're meant to be passed on. The world hadn't changed overnight. Injustice still existed. Pain still lingered. But in countless small ways, people were choosing to be kind. Not because it was easy, but because it was human. And maybe that was enough. Elena walked back to her car, the ocean breeze cool on her face. She didn't have answers to the big questions. But she knew this. When you listen, even when you disagree, you leave room for something real to grow. And sometimes that's where hope begins, not with a shout, not with a headline, but with a wrench, a rag, and a moment of quiet courage that ripples farther than anyone expects.